As gamers, there are some questions we simply may never be able to answer. Does Bigfoot really roam somewhere in amongst the pines of Whetstone County in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas? Why doesn't our favourite plumber's moustache and eyebrow hair match the colour of his head hair? And was anyone fired or held accountable for including this absolute nightmare fuel on the Game Boy camera cartridge? Dear me. But today, I want to tick one such question off our collective lists. It's been hotly debated for decades, with neither side of the kerfuffle backing down from the other. So right here, right now, we settle things. Once and for all. Are video games an art form? The term work of art is thrown around a lot these days. Just about anyone with a skill or talent who happens to perform particularly well on any given day could be credited with delivering a masterpiece. But what makes something an actual work of art has long been a topic of conversation and disagreement. Everyone seems pretty settled when it comes to our mate Lisa, or dear old Dave and his dinky didgeridoo. These are held to be works of art, and fine examples of what constitutes such craft. They're evocative, breathtaking, and offer alternative perspectives on life, perception, and the human form. All things that art is widely accepted as being. But when we go from Mona Lisa to Moaning Lisa of Resident Evil fame, or from Solid Stone David to Solid Snake David, well, suddenly the room is divided in all-out mortal combat. While one half is welcoming in this bright and brilliant new form of expression, the other half is calling for a
fatality.
Perhaps this, then, is where we should start unravelling the debate. A look back at the short history of video gaming and how that compares to the astonishingly ancient history of art. Referring to video games as a bright and brilliant new form of expression might bring about a bright and baffled new expression on your face. But, as with the subject in question, it's all a matter of perspective. With video games celebrating just over 60 years of existence, you'd be forgiven for thinking of them as geriatric at this point. But when you consider the first example of hand-drawn art dates back some 70,000 years, video games are, by comparison, still kicking back in their pushchairs and shaking their rattles like this is Samba de Amigo. Delving into this comparison further, the origins of prehistoric art and video gaming are more similar than you might think. The exact beginnings of man-made art are difficult to pinpoint. Whether it began with the use of attentive engraving design from the Middle Paleolithic era, or the painted origins of figurative art from around 40,000 BC, what is clear from all of these prehistoric art pieces is the relative simplicity of the end product. The genesis of video gaming is much the same, and it didn't begin with Pong, Space Invaders, or Pac-Man like many people think. On the 18th of October 1958, an American physicist by the name of William Higginbotham decided he wanted to liven up the annual Brookhaven National Laboratory Open Day by showing the public that science wasn't just for scientists and could be enjoyed by anyone. To demonstrate this, he created Tennis for Two, a cleverly configured two-player tennis game displayed through an oscilloscope, which was, and still is, typically used for displaying electrical signals and analysing circuitry. By modern standards, Tennis for Two might bring a different kind of tear to your eye than, say, seeing the sunset over Faron Sea in The Legend of Zelda. But, like the prehistoric artwork we just discussed, video games had to start somewhere. In both of these examples, it's safe to say the creator's intention was not to have their work placed in a museum for the general public to admire and discuss. That is, neither of these parties' intentions was to create art. This very detail presents two interesting factors to consider in answering our question of whether video games are an art form. Firstly, does the creator's original intention for the created work count when considering its artistic integrity? And secondly, does where and how a form of creative expression originates matter in the long run? Though we might know that the creator of Tennis for Two had little interest in being recognised as an artist, exactly why the artists behind the prehistoric engravings and cave paintings created their art is impossible to know. But it's safe to bet they weren't hoping to sell their work for a cool mill, quit their stuffy office job, and retire to the Maldives with their favourite woolly mammoth. The question has to be asked then, does something have to be primarily created with the intention of becoming or being art to then be art? The dictionary definition might help us in deciphering this query. Art is defined as the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Pulling this definition apart a little, there is no reference whatsoever to the art piece ever really needing to be intended as art, but instead that it must be perceived and appreciated as such, primarily viewed for its beauty and emotional heft. Though there are definitely video games out there that place visual style over substance, I'm looking at you, Gris, it'd be a tough sell trying to suggest the primary reason we buy video games is to simply look at them longingly. Unless you're one of those weird dead or alive dudes. Gross. That's not to say video games aren't an absolute feast for the eyes, especially the more modern manifestations with all their graphical glitz and visual voluptuousness, but the principal reason we pick up a video game is to play it. And yes, though that is painfully obvious and initially seems like a factor that works against us classifying video games as an art form, we have to dig a little deeper into what makes us want to play them in the first place. A more elementary or linear video game, your FIFAs, Fortnites and Farmvilles, stick very rigidly to the traditional sense of a game. They offer short bursts of contained and prescribed entertainment to pass the time, either alone or with a friend. In the case of these kinds of video games, we very much understand what we'll get in return for our time spent plugged in. But when we load up something a little more substantial, a saga the likes of The Last of Us, Life is Strange or Bioshock, it's not just the gameplay that gets us coming back time and time again. It's not just the heart-pounding encounters, heartbreaking decisions, or heart-stopping shootouts alone that have us hitting up our nearest and dearest to discuss just how life-changing these experiences are. It's the unbelievable stories, unforgettable characters, and simply spectacular worlds that unfold before our eyes. It's how these moments connect with us, challenge us, teach us, and change us that have us hooked and left wanting more. Or, to put it another way, it's our appreciation for the beauty and emotional power behind these human expressions of creative skill and imagination. Just like performance, film, and animation, video games of this ilk have been referred to by many as a form of narrative art, and the evidence in favour of this assessment is certainly hard to deny. For this to be a fair evaluation, it has to be noted that simply tying our commonly held emotional psychology for enjoying video games to the definition of art isn't quite the concrete donkey or conclusive mic drop many of us are looking for. Because of course, for every pro Shigeru Miyamoto and Hideo Kojima hardcore out there who believes these visionaries to be some of the finest artists of our modern times, there's a critic with opinions to the contrary. One such critic is none other than Hideo Kojima himself. In the second most shocking video game moment of 2006, the first being Sonic, the bastard hedgehog, literally and figuratively kissing goodbye to his reputation and status, Kojima stated during an interview with official PlayStation 2 magazine that he didn't believe video games to be art. Instead, he declared that art is the stuff you find in the museum, whether it be a painting or a statue. What I'm doing, what video game creators are doing, is running the museum. How do we light up things? Where do we place things? How do we sell tickets? Kojima's views echoed other notable critics like Roger Ebert on matters such as perceived lack of captivation, cultural importance, and value. All things typically associated with art. And yet, Hideo Kojima remains an auteur in the minds of so many video game lovers and critics alike, boasting artful releases across the span of his career, from the beloved Metal Gear series to 2019's divisive Death Stranding. Returning to our earlier point surrounding the role of the artist in determining what is and isn't art, even if Kojima doesn't consider what he creates as a work of art, many of the audience who engage with his creations do. If Paleolithic painters, whose motives we can never hope to understand, are crowned as artists long after their time here on Earth, then surely the same rationale applies to the creators of today, irrespective of their preferred creative outlet. If enough people deem it art, is that enough to make it so? Kojima and Ebert share another commonly held opinion as to why video games can't be considered as an art form: the need for interaction from the consumer. With traditional forms of art, paintings, sculptures and the like, the practice of engaging with them is passive. The art exists in its complete form without any action from the viewer. Conversely, video games, by their very nature as games, require interaction before they can be experienced. Whether you agree with Kojima and Ebert or not, it is hard to deny their observation here. Is this the nail in the coffin that sends our dream of video games being classed as an art form straight to the game over screen? Not quite.
Here we go!
In 1958, the very same year that Tennis for Two oscillated its way into the annals of video game history, an artist by the name of Alan Capro published an essay in which he introduced what he called happenings to the art world. He defined a happening as a game, an adventure, a number of activities engaged in by participants for the sake of playing. This tore down the long-standing fourth wall that existed between artist and consumer. In effect, the audience became a part of the art. An artwork quite literally designed with interaction and play at its core. 3 years later, Capro created Yard, an immersive junkyard environment consisting of stacked tyres with which his audience could interact. Inspired by his love of the Fluxus movement and blurring the boundaries between conventional art and performance, Capro rewrote the rules of what art could be, ushering in a new era of interactive art. In the same way that William Higginbotham's rudimentary tennis romp set in motion a series of events that led all the way to Wii remotes being flung around living rooms and through television screens, so too did Capro's frenetic and improvised art installations lead the way for body art, process art, and arguably even flash mobs in the very same 50-year period. I think we've almost reached a verdict. Any objections? Perhaps the problem people have with classifying video games as an art form has more to do with the established boundaries and traditions of the art world than it does with video games themselves. All across the 20th and 21st century, artistic evolution and reinvention has been met with resistance at every turn, forcing into existence anti-art movements like Dadaism that challenge the outdated and stagnant principles on which art is governed and judged. As the tools with which to create our art develop and progress, so too will our imagination and creative desire. If artists throughout the ages had refused such advancements, we'd still be carving primitive patterns into stone and would have never been graced with the grandeur of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, felt the pull of Dali's persistence of memory, or taken a moment of silence in the wake of Holz's vigil. We've come a long way technologically since the oscilloscopes of the 1950s, which is why we've now got all this gorgeous gaming gear that lights up our living rooms instead of some gigantic, whirring monstrosity munching through our electricity each month. And as this technology has improved and evolved, so too have the creators who use it. Combining the very best bits of pre-existing narrative art forms like film and literature with cutting-edge technology, these artists bring their moving modern-day masterpieces to life for each and every one of us. As a medium for expression and creating immersive worlds and moments for us to explore, video gaming is still in its infancy, but youth isn't a metric by which to measure something's artistic integrity. Just ask Capro and his captivated crowds back in 1961. So back to the question at hand. I think the history, evolution, and unforgettable experiences speak for themselves. Video games are as much an art form as any other out there. A new, modern, immersive art form, and one with a vibrant future ahead, but an art form all the same. Of course, that's not to say every video game qualifies for such a prestigious accolade, but then, not every painting is a Monet. At their very best, Video games have the power to move their audiences, to make us think, feel, love and lament all within a singular save file. They reflect and influence our global culture, connecting people from across continents and building lasting and loving communities, all in celebration of this global phenomenon that is just a button's push away. Art has never been so accessible and, arguably, never this much fun either. And if video games are breaking down barriers for people to love, discuss and embrace art, especially within their own homes, then this is something to be very happy about indeed. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below on whether you think video games are an art form and which 3 games you'd display in your own personal art gallery. While you're there, why not create a save file so we can carry on this adventure together another time? Just hit the subscribe button and ring the bell if you're feeling particularly legendary. I've been Adam at Glitchqraft, and you've been absolutely bloody wonderful. See you again soon.